Okay, so new cards. Aeromoeba is just like a souped up Narcomoeba. If you want it, you want it. That's all I'm going to say about that. Burdened Aerialist is an interesting card. I mean, it's a 3-mana 3/1 that ETBs to make a treasure. It's not amazing. You're probably not going to play it in most of your decks, but it's not out of the question, especially if you're building some sort of treasure tribal thing, right? Like, if you just want as many treasure tokens as you possibly can, there are worse things than Aerialist, especially, again, because it is a blinkable body, which means you can, again, reanimate it, blink it, bounce it, whatever, and just get more treasures out of it. Not the worst. Dressed Down is a real weird one. Honestly, I'm not sure what to make of this card yet. It strikes me as being a little bit too finicky for its own good. Is my my evaluation of this sort of at face value. So it's a 2-mana enchantment with flash. It says when it enters the battlefield, draw a card. So it does replace itself if nothing else, which is very reasonable. And then it just says creatures lose all abilities, just straight up. That's just like a blanket line of state-based effects that it has. However, at the beginning of your end step, you sacrifice it. So it's not just a 2-mana humility with flash that cantrips. That would obviously be busted. It does have that sort of downside of sacrificing itself. But what it does is that obviously you sort of use this as a sort of strange disruptive piece to probably shut off somebody's combo or something, where you're basically like, somebody else's creatures having abilities is not good for you or for the table in some way. And so you flash this in, you get your card back, so you didn't just kind of waste it on the one-shot effect. And then for this turn, that opponent that you're trying to mess with doesn't get to do the thing that they wanted to do, right? So, like, for example, you flash this in, I don't know who's playing Kiki combo in Commander, but if somebody is doing that, you can flash this in response to them playing their Pestermite or their Kiki Chiki or whatever. It loses all its abilities, so they don't get to combo. This dies in the end step, but then what you get to do, of course, is then it buys the entire table an extra turn to deal with one of those combo pieces before they get to untap again. And that can be all they needed, right? Maybe they had a sorcery speed removal spell, but not an instant one, but now they're going to get another turn to cast it. So it'll be a role player. It'll be situational. Again, you're probably going to already know if you want this in your blue decks or not, because it is far from a staple. But it is a niche role player that will probably make for some very interesting and exciting moments once in a while. Floodhound is pretty good, not just because it's a good play on words, but a 1-mana 1/2 with a admittedly expensive ability, but one that is repeatable, is kind of interesting to me. Like 3-mana tap to investigate on a 1-mana 1/2. I don't think you're winning any records with this, but I don't know why this card like feels playable somewhere to me. Although again, very niche, very fringe, etc. But interesting. Fractured Sanity is a pretty good mill card. That's really all I have to say about this. I suspect Modern Mill is probably interested in this effect. Like between that and the one that it got from the latest Zendikar set, the one that has Kicker, I'm expecting that deck to be about as playable as it's ever been. 3-mana to have everybody mill 14 cards is like no joke, honestly. I mean, you assume that Glimpse the Unthinkable, right? 2-mana mill 10 is still kind of like the industry staple. This is worse than that on rate in that it is not 50% better than that for an extra, even though it costs 50% more mana. But the fact that it also just cycles to mill 4 cards and replaces itself, obviously, in the process, means that even when it's not good enough for 3 mana, it can still do something at 2 mana and draw you into a Glimpse, right? Or something like that. Like, I think it's a cool card. I am no mill player. I have not looked at that deck in years. But I would expect this to at least be in a conversation to be played, even if it may not ultimately be good enough. But I think it's cool, and it's another good tool for that deck to have, I think. We got some heavy hitters here, I think. Maybe heavy hitters is overstating it, but some interesting cards. We got a whole row of cool cards to go here. So Hard Evidence is actually like a really cool card. It's kind of like an innocuous card at first, right? It's a 1-mana card, but it makes 2 different tokens for a single blue mana. At sorcery, mind you, but still. So you get a 1/3 blue crab, or sorry, a 0/3 blue crab. Definitely different than a 1/3, but still, you get a 0/3 blue crab, and then you also just get to investigate, which of course means you get to get a clue as well. And getting that for a single mana, it triggers a lot of synergies, right? If you have anything that cares about tokens entering the battlefield, it'll trigger those potentially twice, depending on whether it cares about creature tokens or just any tokens. I'm actually going to like jump ahead to like Junkwinder here for a second, just because they are very interlinked. But like these two cards, I have to assume in Modern Horizons draft are going to be ridiculous, even though that's not what we're here to talk about. But right, like both of these tokens reduce the cost of Junkwinder by 1 each, right? So you've already gone from a 7 mana card to a 5 mana card, which is a big difference. And then if you were to cast Hard Evidence after Junkwinder enters, both of those tokens entering would allow you to then activate Junkwinder's other ability. And so like there's a lot of synergy to be had there. And that's just like one immediate example of those things. But I think it's quite good. I've heard people talking about Polymorph EDH being in love with this card just because it's a 1-drop that creates a random 0/3 creature. But it's not a creature that makes a token. Like it's a spell that makes a creature token for cheap in blue. And so if you're polymorphing, then like this is a way to get a creature for cheap to then polymorph it into a real creature that's in your deck, like, you know, some big Tidespout, Tyrant, Nezahal type thing, which sounds pretty sweet to me for sure. So that's pretty exciting. So again, this is one of those like sort of what I call like, you know, like role player cards, right? It's not going to be the flashiest card in your deck, but there are going to be decks that like shouldn't sleep on this, in my opinion. Like it's going to overperform in the decks where it's good. Next we have Inevitable Betrayal, which is continuing the sort of pattern of like taking a really powerful reserve list card and slapping Suspend on it and seeing if it's good. So this one, of course, is the Suspend version of Bribery, which says search target opponent's library for a creature card and put that card onto the battlefield under your control, then that player shuffles. So basically just for 1 and 2 blue, you suspend it for 3 turns, and on that last turn, when you take the last suspend counter off, you get to search your opponent's library for any creature you want, and you just get it. Full stop, right? Bribery, again, like this is not a new effect, because this is literally just, again, a suspend version of Bribery. But it's a powerful effect. And whereas I didn't love the white one because it gave your opponent a lot of time to prepare, this one is hard to prepare for, right? Obviously, if your opponent's playing blue, they might have a counterspell, and they're going to know to hold one up for when this comes off of Suspend. And that's fair. They still have advance warning. But it also won't cost you any mana the turn that happens, which means that they need to have a hard answer to something you're not even paying mana for the turn it's mattering. So in a lot of ways, I almost like this more than Bribery, as weird as that sounds, like as weird as that might sound, because paying 3 mana on one turn on some random turn and then having it pay off later is in a lot of ways better than paying 5 mana on one turn and having it happen right away, because 5 mana is just more mana to spend, right? The jump from 3 to 5 is huge, like more than it looks like on paper, in terms of like how much else you get to do on that turn. And so I think that getting this effect for free later on is a big deal, because you're not having to tap out, right? If they counter this spell, then you can have like another good spell lined up, and now they don't have the counter for that one, right? So this can kind of be like a bait spell, or they just don't have a counter and you just get to take their stuff for free. Like that's sweet too. So I actually like this card a lot in a deck that wants to be playing with Bribery effects. Not every deck wants to be doing that, but I do think that this card is actually quite good. And does compare favorably to Bribery, not in terms of the immediacy of the effect, but in terms of the flexibility that it grants you on the turn where it's happening. So we talked about Junkwinder a little bit a minute ago, but I just kind of want to look at it again, because for like a 7 mana 5/6 is not a particularly exciting card, but the affinity mechanic, for anyone who's never played with it, the affinity mechanic is a really broken mechanic. Like just arbitrarily reducing the cost on things that should cost X amount of mana is really, really not to be underestimated. And the fact that this is affinity for tokens is A, kind of cool. That's never been a thing before as far as I know. And B, it also is an affinity for creature tokens, which means that, again, every treasure you have, every clue you have, every food you have, in addition to every, Thopter, spirit, whatever else you're looking at, beast token, they all reduce it. I genuinely think that in the right commander deck, like a commander deck that cares about making tokens in some way. So I'm thinking like, God, now I'm drawing a blank, of course. But like I'm thinking things like Tatyova. I'm thinking things like, wait, no, not Tatyova. That's not the card I meant. Bloody hell, Tishana is what I meant to say. Coma, Serpents, or was it something Coil, right? The World Serpent from Kaldheim. These are all cards where decks where I genuinely think Junkwinder is just going to cost blue at all times. That's just going to be the thing. Which is really, really good because blue for a 5/6 with an additional ability on top of that is very strong, right? A two mana 5/6 that basically just freezes your opponent's stuff every time a new token of any kind once again enters is just a very strong effect. So don't look at this, in my opinion, as a 7 mana creature. It's like, honestly, in my opinion, at worst, going to be like a 4 mana 5/6. Like, if you're ever paying more than 4 mana for this card, it's probably just not the right deck for that card. In the right deck, this will cost 4 or less and probably just 2 all the time, and it will be incredible in those decks. All right, moving on. Once again, just a brief art appreciation moment for yet another bad card with fantastic art. So this is a really, really beautiful piece by Nils Ham. I'm hoping I pronounced that properly. It might be Ham. I think it's Ham, though. I don't know. Either way, beautiful piece. Nils, you killed it. Good job. Unfortunately, it's a pretty wonky card. Like, this is going to be like 5 mana draw 3 most of the time, which is just like not it. Like, we can do so much better at sorcery speed nowadays, so yeah. Like, actually, like, let's just look at, like, now that the next card I don't even think is particularly playable, but it's definitely just already better than this card, despite being a common. This one's an uncommon. But, you know, 6 mana instant speed, draw 3. Also not stellar, but already better. And it has basic land cycling, so it's not even dead if you don't have the 6 mana. I think this is the first blue mythic, Murktide Regent. So another one that has a cost reducing mechanic. So again, doesn't really cost 7 mana in practice. So this is a 7 mana 3/3 with Delve. So again, for anyone who doesn't know, Delve is every time you can exile cards from your graveyard while casting the spell to pay for 1 generic. So basically, this can be as cheap as 2 blue mana and exile 5 cards from your graveyard in order to cast this. It has flying. It's a dragon, so that makes sense. It enters the battlefield with a 1/1 counter for each instant or sorcery card exiled. So you can exile any number, any kind of card to the Delve mechanic, but the more instants and sorceries that you exile to it, the larger it is when it comes into play. So this is obviously like the dream scenario here is that this is a 2 mana 8/8 flyer, right? Because you delve 5 instants and sorceries away, so it enters with 5 counters, and you only paid 2 blue mana for it. So you created yourself a 2 mana 8/8, which is admittedly pretty busted. And also just an additional line of text, just because why not? Anytime an instant or sorcery leaves your graveyard, and this is for any reason, right? Flashback would work, any sort of regrowth style effect would work. You get to put another counter on the Murktide Regent. So at the end of the day, this is just kind of a big dopey beat stick. I would not be surprised if this sees play in Modern. Again, the Delve mechanic is a strong mechanic. I mean, everybody remembers Hogak. But in EDH, this just doesn't interest me. It's just a big, chunky flyer for possibly cheap. I don't know. It's just not that interesting. If you need a beater, like, it's good and it's cheap, but I don't know. This doesn't feel like it to me. Let's see. All right, moving on. We got, like, again, a lot of these cards are interesting, and like almost none of these cards are actually unplayable anywhere, but I'm just gonna like talk about the ones that interest me because, you know, it's my set review. So we're just gonna move along to Rise and Shine. So Rise and Shine is one and a blue for a sorcery that says target non-creature artifact you control becomes a 0/0 artifact creature. Put 4 1/1 counters on each artifact that became a creature this way. And it has Overload for 4 and 2 blue. So you are basically looking at either animating, like, you know, some random Mishra's Bauble, Pyrite Spellbomb type thing. You can animate your soul rings and stuff as well, but excuse me, my throat's getting dry. But you probably don't want to be animating your mana rocks unless you like really need the 4/4. But yeah, basically it just lets you turn your like random little utility artifacts into actual threats. Ichor Wellspring strikes me as being like a really good target for this. Because right, it enters the battlefield, draws you a card, then you cast Rise and Shine, make it into a 4/4, and if it ever dies, you draw another card. And it's obviously easier to kill a 4/4 than it is to kill a random inanimate artifact. Especially one that your opponent is not incentivized to try to want to kill if it is just a random 2-mana do-nothing artifact on the board. Of course, the real spice is in the overload cost, where right you target everything legally targetable by it. Because if you have a whole bunch of random little trinkety artifacts lying around, you've suddenly got a bit of an army in a can, more or less out of nowhere. And that could put some pretty real pressure on there, right? It does a pretty decent like March of the Machines impression. But notably, this also only affects your stuff, right? March of the Machines does affect everybody, right? And so you're also granting your opponent blockers in a lot of weird scenarios. In this case, you're the only one who benefits, which means you get to attack with a bunch of surprise artifacts, and your opponent won't have the ability to block, at least not with, freshly made creatures. They have to block with the existing creatures they already had. Pretty cool card. Definitely going to see play. Like, I can definitely see, like, Emery, Lurker of the Loch, and, like, Psy Master Thopterus type decks being really interested in this as a finishing effect. So yeah, definitely expect this to see play if there's anybody playing blue-based artifacts at your local game store or in your own play group. Rishadan Dockhand, literally just they turned Rishadan Port into a Merfolk, gave it Island Walk and made it a 1/2. I think it's a good card. I don't think it's like terribly exciting because I don't think Rishadan Port is a particularly playable card in Commander. But you can still like proactively tap down people's Cabal coffers. Kind of notably comes to mind as like being like probably the most, or I guess Gaia's Cradle too. Though that one sees less play just from price tag alone, if nothing else. But yeah, if your opponent's got lands that are tapping for like arbitrarily large amounts of mana, or like have some sort of other like really strong effect, and you've got a random mana lying around, you can tap this and that and stop them from getting to use that, right? You tap it in their upkeep so that odds are they don't get to make use of the mana or the card in their upkeep, probably. Or at least they're forced to do so in a time that might be inconvenient for them. Or not not allow them to do other things on their own turn, etc., etc. So, and hey, if you're playing Merfolk Tribal and Commander, like, there's a lot of spots to fill in a Merfolk Tribal deck. And this is probably, a pretty decent one. So, pretty cool card. Said and Done is the next card. I think this card is pretty cool, but it's probably not better than just playing, like, Pull from the Deep. Because I don't think the Done effect is very good. So if you're really in for the set effect, there are better versions of it. It's a good effect, but I think there are better cards that do the same thing. All right, moving on. Okay, this is a spicy row here. So Subtlety is the blue version of that elemental incarnation cycle that Solitude was a part of earlier. This one, in my opinion, is a lot less exciting from a commander perspective. This card, I think, is most easily comparable to, like, Venser Shaper Savant, where it enters the battlefield and returns a creature or planeswalker spell to the top or bottom of its owner's library. Now, notably, this is your opponent's choice, not yours. So if they don't want to redraw it, they don't have to. But if they do want to redraw it, you can't be like, no, that goes to the bottom. That is your opponent's choice. So, again, I mean, the base rate is not bad, right? It's a 4-mana 3/3 flash flyer. Like, that is just a good card in and of itself, generally speaking. And the effect is totally fine. I just, again, I'm not in love with the somewhat harsh restriction of just creature or planeswalker spell. Like, notably, Venser can bounce literally anything. So, like, if it was a heads-up choice between those two, even with the evoke mode on this, I would play Venser over this card every time. However, if you are just playing some sort of deck where you're just bouncing things all the time, or you just want a critical mass of this sort of effect, this is a decent spell. Like, let nobody tell you it's bad. It's just not very exciting to me. but it is more of a reasonably strong effect. Okay, the next one we have is a card literally called Suspend, which, as you might guess, suspends things. So this one in particular is 1 in a blue. It says exile target creature and put 2 time counters on it. And if it doesn't already have Suspend, it gains Suspend. So the reason for that is because if it didn't have Suspend as an actual ability, the time counters would do nothing and it would just be perma-exiled, regardless of the time counters. But what Suspend says is at the beginning of each of your upkeep, remove a time counter. It basically it allows the card to come back eventually. Otherwise, it would just be a 1-mana no downside Swords of the Plowshares in blue, which would be very, very good. So this card is not that good. It does have a downside, which is that the card will eventually come back, and for free, no less. But if you just really like, if it really kind of depends on what the creature is, right? So if the creature has a really good ETB ability, you probably don't want to suspend it. But if it's like, you know, a sort of Sheldred, Elish Norn type of card where you just kind of need it gone for a couple of turns so you can build your own board out and not have to worry about that, this is a really, really cheap way of making sure that happens. Now, if I'm playing white, I can't imagine ever wanting this card over just playing, you know, Swords and Path first and foremost. And I don't know how many of that effect you actually want in a deck total. But again, in a non-white deck, this is just about one of the cleanest answers to a creature that you can ask for. As long as you remember that you need to have a plan for what happens when it comes back off to Suspend again. Because you're only buying yourself a couple of turns. So if you can't close the game or find a solution to it in a couple of turns, it's just right back into the fire for you. So, you know, buyer beware, you know, user advisory, whatever. But it is a really strong effect, and it definitely will probably see some play at the EDH table. So, you know, expect to see your stuff getting suspended from time to time, and not of your own accord. Our next card is I need to make sure I'm pronouncing this properly. I'm probably not going to, but man, I actually don't know how to say this out loud. I can say it in my head, but it doesn't translate well. It's like Civilian. I think it's Svielun. I don't know. This is like definitely like some like, you know, saffron olive tier. I have no idea what this word is. I'm going to say Svielun, and feel free to correct me in the comments if you have a better pronunciation for this. I would love to know. But so of Sea and Sky. So she is a 3-mana, 1/2 blue, legendary creature Merfolk God. She's a 3/4, so a 3/4 for 3, like already pretty cool. Legendary, so of course you can only have one. So this is also, I think, possibly our first legendary creature of the review. So, you know, this is the Commander review, so that's interesting to us. So she has Indestructible, so this is another riff on the gods are harder to kill than normal creatures thing. This one requires you to have 2 other Merfolk, which is cool. So basically, if she has enough worshippers, right? She is the god of Merfolk. If she has enough worshippers, she's indestructible. But if, you know, which actually I think is extremely flavorful in my opinion, right? If she has nobody or not enough, not enough, devotion from her followers, and I do mean devotion in the conversational sense and not the magic mechanical sense, then she's no longer indestructible. So she's more vulnerable now. Whenever she attacks, you get to draw a card, just straight up. That's an attack trigger, notably, not a non-hit trigger, which is pretty cool. And she grants other Merfolk Ward 1, which is, the, at the time of this recording, newish mechanic, which is, I think, probably / hopefully replacing Hexproof, which is to say that you have to pay the ward cost in order to legally target a spell, a creature with the ability. So if you have a Doomblade, you have to pay an extra 1 to Doomblade a creature with Ward 1, which is pretty cool. I mean, again, as with most tribal creatures, it's basically an instant shoe-in to any of those, to any Merfolk deck that is playing blue, which I have to assume is all of them. And basically irrelevant everywhere else. So basically, if you're a Merfolk player, this is great. If you're not, keep looking. But it is a very powerful Merfolk, so it does bear mentioning. Thought Monitor is a really, really cool card. I like this one a lot. So again, I was talking earlier about how powerful the affinity mechanic is. This is kind of the same thing. So this is 6 colorless and a blue for a 2/2 flyer. So a 7 mana 2/2 flyer. That's awful. However, it has affinity for artifacts, right? So every artifact you have will discount this by 1 generic mana. So this can be as cheap as a 1 mana 2/2 flyer that when it enters the battlefield draws you 2 cards. That's really strong. If this is even a 3 mana 2/2 flyer, the ATBs to draw you 2 cards, that's ridiculous. You just got a divination with a 2/2 flyer attached to it. Like, I think that as long as you're paying like 4 mana or less, you are getting a perfectly fine deal. And if you're ever paying 1 mana for this, like, you just basically got away with a crime. I think that this card, you need to play it in an artifact heavy deck, obviously. But in any artifact deck, this card is just an absolute slam dunk. So again, I'm thinking, Brea, I'm thinking Emry, I'm thinking Sai, I'm thinking Urza, unfortunately. Not that Urza needs the help. But, these are all decks where this card is just going to consistently cost 1, 2, maybe 3 mana and just be a 2/2 flyer that draws 2 cards. And of course, because it's an Enter the Battlefield ability, right, it's blinkable with things like Thassa, Conjurer's Closet, Ephemerate, you name it, all the usual suspects. I think this card is super good. It's not breaking anything, but it's just such good value for so little mana, despite, the seeming 7 mana price tag. It's always going to cost less than this, and if it doesn't, again, it probably just shouldn't be in your deck. But I think this card is fantastic. Tide Shaper is a new merfolk. It is a 1 mana 1/1 with kicker 1 colorless. It gets +1/+1 as long as an opponent controls an island, and the kicker allows you to turn one of your opponent's lands. Actually, just target land, to be fair. So you can turn one of your own lands, but that might not be helpful. But turn a land into an island for as long as this card remains on the battlefield. So basically, if you pay the kicker, it is just guaranteed a 2/2. At which point it's a 2 mana 2/2. But you're also paying EDH, so there's a good chance that if this is in your Merfolk tribal deck, it's probably just a 1 mana 2/2, and that's fine as well, because Merfolks are about critical mass, as most tribal decks tend to be. Alright, and that is it for blue cards that I would like to talk about. Let's move on to black now.